All right, so let's keep talking knitting. We're looking at the little paper band here that came on our ball of yarn that we wound up. And if you recall, the knitting recommendations here were for a US size 6 or 4 millimeter needle. So now here I have 3 different swatches. Then I went ahead and knitted up the same exact yarn. All I did differently was use a different size needle. So these are all the same number of stitches going across by the same number of rows tall, and you can see the huge difference in the 3 swatches. Now knitting swatches like this, if you sew, it's the same way that you would take a swatch or get a swatch from a fabric shop so that you can feel the fabric, stretch it if it has some stretch, feel the weight of it. So this is the same idea. You knit up a swatch so you can have an idea of what your finished fabric will be in the project. And you can see that it's not always just dependent on the yarn and the fiber type. This also has a lot to do with what size needle you're using that will determine how the fabric will be. First, let's have a look at all 3 of them. You see that they're all rolling. Now this is typical of stockinette stitch, which means I knit on the right side row and I purled on the wrong side rows. So let me give you a close-up of these knit and purl stitches so you can start familiarizing yourself with how they look. So this is the right side, meaning the front of the swatch when it's done in stockinette. So on the front side, you'll have these knit stitches, and the stitches are like a V shaped, or sometimes they kind of look like a little heart. That's a stitch, okay? These are called knit stitches. When we flip them over, you see that the back side doesn't have those V's. It's more like smiley faces and frowns that interlock, and this is the purl side, so you can see how those look different, okay? So this is the purl side, which would be the wrong side, and this is the right side, or the knit side. All right, so that is stockinette stitch or stocking stitch. Sometimes you hear it called that. Knits on the front and purls on the back. Now, we talked about this rolling. It's just the nature of stockinette stitch, so that's gonna happen to you every time. Sometimes you'll see people make a swatch, and instead of just starting off with knit stitches on the front and the purl stitches on the back, what they'll do is they'll do knit rows front and back at the bottom to kind of anchor the fabric down, and then go into knitting on the front and purling on the back, and that will help keep this edge flat and keep it from rolling a little bit. So typically, say you were making a sweater out of this, you would have some type of ribbing on one end or the other that would kind of anchor the fabric down. Sometimes people use this as a decorative element or a design element in their patterns, and they'll have a rolled edge, right, so that it rolls. And so in those instances, they're going for that rolled look. So just know that if you're doing stockinette stitch, this is a typical occurrence here because it's just the nature of the stitch. And if we look and analyze what the relationship is between needle size and the finished fabric, you'll see that here for this swatch, I used a 4 millimeter needle. I just put these little knots here. Shout out to my friend Sun for showing me this little trick when you're making swatches, so that you don't have to like mark up this or put a little note or something. You can just do little knots on one of the tail ends to tell you what US size needle, or in my case, I used all metric needles. So this 4 knots on here signifies a 4 millimeter needle that I used to knit this swatch, and that is correct. That's the 4 millimeter needle. This one is 5 millimeter needle, and then this one I use a 7 millimeter needle. So 4 millimeter, 5, and 7, and you can see the difference. Same yarn, same number of rows, and same number of stitches, and the swatches are totally different sizes. So if we look at the smallest one with 4 millimeter, which, if you recall, is what they recommended, if I use that needle, I'm gonna end up with a pretty dense swatch. See how little and compact it is? This would really work in a project that you wanted something to keep you really nice and warm, because the fabric is way more put together. Even if I tug on it like this, you can barely see through it because the stitches are so close together, making this a really nice and dense fabric. Now let's have a look at a 5 millimeter needle. So just because the manufacturer tells us, hey, this is the recommended needle size to use, it's important to make a swatch. And I will admit, I hate making swatches. I'm not a fan of them, whether in crochet or knitting. But the more I get into garments and items that need to fit some part of the body, whether it be a sock or a sweater, I find that I'm starting to enjoy more and more making these swatches, because then it makes the entire knitting process of the project a lot more enjoyable, because I know I'm going to get at least close to what the aim is for the fit versus just winging it. And I know that I knit pretty tight already. So I know that if my style of knitting is not as loose as a designer whose pattern I'm looking through, my fabric is not going to end up being the same as theirs. So it's important to make sample swatches using the recommended needle. Then we'll measure the stitches based on what the pattern tells you to. And often you'll find this, in the designer's notes in the pattern. They'll tell you across a 2-inch measurement or across a 4-inch measurement, you should have 12 stitches. You should have 20. So when you stitch out a little sample piece like this, you need to measure and see if you've gotten gauge, meaning that your number of stitches for whatever the measurement the designer is telling you to measure matches theirs. And so to get it there, you'll just basically go up in needle sizes or down until you're creating a fabric that matches the designed pattern. So now this one is a 5mm needle. So again, this is 1 millimeter larger than what is recommended by the yarn company here. If we place this here, you can see that it's wider. It's also taller. So you can see the difference. If I'm working on a sweater that is meant to come out to my size in this type of a fabric, and I make it in this, it's going to be a lot bigger. It's going to fit you looser, right? So that is the idea. For those of you that sew, we use our fabric and we cut our fabric down to size. In knitting and crochet, you're doing two things at once. You're making the project and you're making the fabric at the same time. So you have to ensure that the size of your stitches, how close they are together, how far they are apart, is going to equal the fabric piece you need. So there's one extra level there of complexity if you're comparing these yarn crafts to sewing. Sewing, we just cut our fabric to size, which can already give people problems. But here, you have to make sure that the stitches and their size together equal the fabric you need for your project. So a 5mm swatch, you can see that the fabric is a little bit more loose. It's bigger. It's a little drapier because the stitches are not that tight and close together. So it drapes a little bit more. All right, here we have the last sample, which is done with a 7mm needle, which you can even just see by looking at it is a lot bigger and chunkier than the smaller size needles. And I wanted to go up more than one needle size so you can see the drastic difference. And all this is just going to increase and get bigger and bigger if you're using bigger and bigger needles, okay? So you'll have to test that out. Now remember, this largest one is the most open, the biggest, and the airiest of all of our swatches here. It rolls the least because the stitches are so spread apart, and that has to do with the size of the needle, right? There's so much more loose yarn everywhere with each stitch because it's a lot more roomy than the smaller needle sizes. So if we look at this sample, you can see that by barely tugging on it, I can see right through it. It's pretty sheer, meaning it's a more lightweight fabric. It's drapier. It flops a little bit more, so more drape. It's the same yarn, all right, and the same stitch pattern. I did stockinette on all three of these, but it's a lot drapier than the really dense fabric that we did here with the 4mm size needle. So keep that in mind, and that's how you play around with your own patterns or patterns that you buy that you're making. You can change up the drape of the fabric by the needle size that you choose, okay? And you can see that this is a lot bigger. So going back to talking about patterns or garments that need to fit, if I'm working on a sweater and the gauge should be something like this, and I make it like this, you can imagine that you're going to be swimming in it. It's going to fit you so many more sizes larger simply because you used a different needle size, even though you used the same pattern, went by the same number of stitches, and you used the exact same yarn maybe that the designer did. The needle size is crucial, and you have to check your gauge. So now let me grab a little ruler so I can show you how you would measure the gauge in these swatches. Now let me grab a ruler, but first I wanted to say that typically you would make your swatches and then you would block them. And blocking them, you can do it a variety of different ways. Some people just steam block it, meaning they put some steam over top of the swatch with their iron and then kind of let it dry out flat. You can wet it completely in some wool wash and then just lightly pat it out, put it on a towel and let it air dry. And it does affect the finished fabric, especially in the finished garment. So whatever you're trying out new, if it's a new pattern, a new stitch design, or a new yarn to you, block the swatch just as you would the finished project so you can know what's going to happen to it. Sometimes the yarn will stretch out more than you need it to, right? Sometimes you need to shape it as it pats dry. So you would treat the swatches the same way that you would the finished garment, and then you would measure them to make sure that you're going to be measuring the correct stitch count and row count, just as you would expect it to come out in the finished garment. But for instruction purposes here, I'm just going to pretend that these have been blocked. They have not been, but you would take a ruler and measure and count your stitches and make sure that it matches what the designer says that it should match for the project that you're making. Now for the measurements, the pattern will tell you what the measurement is and how many stitches in that allotted measurement. Some patterns will say in 2 inches by 2 inches, some will say in 4 inches by 4 inches, or 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. Whatever it is, make sure that you're counting stitches in that dimension. So let's pretend that my pattern tells me in 2 inch by 2 inch space. So let's count our stitches, and the stitches are counted this way horizontally. First, I'll place the edge of my ruler at the bottom row here of a row of stitches. I think that's okay. I typically like to count somewhere in the center to stay away from the edges that might be slightly distorted, either by rolling or because I cast on or bound off too tight or too loose. So somewhere in the middle, I think, gives me the truest count. Then we're going to start counting here in this 2 inch measurement. So I'm going to place this here at the beginning of this stitch, right here. So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stitches, and that one ends right there. So 7 stitches across 2 inches this way. So what if my pattern said you should have 5 stitches going this way along the 2 inch dimension, right? So if the pattern tells you should have 5 and you have 7, you have to stop and analyze what that means. That means I have too many stitches in there, right? You have 7, you only want 5. So if you think about what do I need to do to the fabric to spread those stitches out more so there's not more than what I need in there, think about making it bigger, spreading the fabric out. That means you can go up a needle size and use a bigger needle, and that will give you less stitches in that space. So that means that whatever needle I use for this, if the pattern says that this was the recommended needle size, and I should have only 5 stitches across this way and I have 7, I know I need to go up even bigger in the needle size until I can measure and have the 5 that the pattern tells me that I need. So now let's measure rows, and rows are going to be measured vertically this way. So I'm going to put it here at the start of a stitch, and then I'm going to count down to 2 inches to see what I get. Let me find, that's a good point there. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 rows, okay? Same thing. If the pattern says that you should have less, that means you fit in too many, so you need to go up in the needle size. And that's how you start adjusting your gauge, by using bigger or smaller needles, all right? So you saw that across here in 2 inches, we had 7 inches. Let's go ahead and measure on the smaller swatch and see what we get. All right, so on this one, we're still going to measure 2 inches, and let's see how many more. I know just by looking at it, right, this one is smaller than this one that we just measured, so I should have a lot more stitches in that measurement, right, because the stitches are also smaller. So let's count and see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 stitches. So here we had 7 stitches in a 2 inch measurement. Here we have 9, and I can guarantee you this one is going to have more than 9, right? The smaller you go, the tighter the stitches, the more in number, right, in quantity of stitches there will be in the same measurement that you're measuring here, 2 inches in our case. So I think I had 9 on the previous one in rows. Let's count here for 2 inches and see how many this ended up with. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 11 and a half. Okay, so again, more stitches both in stitch count this way and in row count this way. Because it's a smaller, denser piece, we used a smaller needle than the first swatch that we measured. So just for fun, let's go ahead and measure the smallest one, which is what was recommended by the yarn manufacturer. So for here along a 2 inch measurement, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 stitches across. I'm going to have even more in the rows, I'm sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 stitches for the rows, 14 rows in the same 2-inch measurement. Okay, so you can see how the number of stitches is directly affected by the needle size. This is one thing that people have a lot of trouble with. When they're making sweaters, they'll say, oh, I chose the size based on my body measurements and it ended up being too big. You have to look at the finished garment measurements, just like I tell you all in the sewing videos. Finished garment measurements, and then choose your needle size accordingly so that you can make the project and at the same time make the fabric the size that you want it to be. And if we reference back to the tag that came on our yarn, you'll see that for that recommended needle size, the 4mm, which for me is the one that I use on the smallest swatch here, it says that I should end up with a gauge that's 5 to 5.5 stitches per inch. And if you recall on this one, I had 12 stitches in the 2-inch measurement. So that means I get about 6 inches to the inch and not the 5 to 5.5 stitch as recommended per inch on the tag of the yarn. So this doesn't really mean anything to me because this is just a guideline. The actual true fabric that I will be knitting is based on my hand, my tension, and how I knit, right? So you can see why it would be very important to make these swatches because you don't know how you're gonna knit up that swatch of that specific yarn with whatever specific needle that you're using. You don't wanna spend all the time working on a sweater or on a pair of socks or something and not have it end up fitting because you didn't take a little while up front to work out some swatches, get gauge so you have the correct number of stitches and rows per whatever many inches the pattern tells you. When you get to this point, it takes a while and it's some extra work, but it does feel so great knowing that you can jump right into your project and you know you're spot on with your gauge. All right, so we talked about gauge. You already see the relationship between smaller needle sizes, denser fabric, bigger needle sizes, drapier, more open fabric. So keep that in mind, okay? Then I showed you how to measure and tell what are your stitches so you can measure stitches across and rows vertically also, so you can have a good start to getting gauge with whatever your first project is. Now, some of the first projects that I would recommend to start with are things that don't have to fit a body, right? A scarf, something that won't make a difference whether it's a little bit bigger than it's supposed to be or a little bit smaller. If it's just a drapey scarf or a cowl, that's a great beginner project for you to practice making a gauge swatch, measuring your gauge, and of course, practicing your knit stitches. All right, so I'm gonna get this all out of the way and then we'll move on to showing you how you would start your first project. Once you've chosen the correct needle size and you have the yarn you wanna work with, let's talk about making a slip knot and practice our knit stitches.